Stay away from me! Get away from me!
Growing up in the 1970s, 1980s, and 90s, video games was a big part of our lives.
In video games, not just in arcades, but also in drugstores, pizza parlors, supermarkets.
In some sections of the city, we have a machine or two machines and sometimes three machines in virtually every single corner store in a neighborhood.
Officials say they are responding to complaints from parents that children have skipped school or stolen money to play the games and made a nuisance of themselves.
Senior citizens have rights. They have rights to go into the laundromat and wash their laundry in peace. They don't have to go buy two or three machines or kids congregating and passing fast remarks as they walk in and terrorizing them in some instances.
There was a time when the video arcade room was a big part of our culture. Even if there wasn't an arcade room within walking distance, there was a time when you could find a video arcade machine in any corner damn near. We would find these games in gas stations, laundromats, even at restaurants. Of course, the place one really wanted to go was to the actual arcade room. We would usually find arcade rooms in shopping malls, but there was also arcade rooms that were independent from the malls and stood on their own. Most of these arcade rooms operated on a token system. If you found a video arcade machine that was not in the mall, usually you would have to place a quarter in the machine. In the late 1970s, video game consoles made their way into homes across America.
Out here we entertain ourselves at home, so we got an Atari video game. There's so many different games to play. We especially like Space Invaders, zapping those little devils from outer space. It's fun, but personally I think the whole idea of creatures from outer space is a little far-fetched.
No other company offers you as many different video game cartridges as Atari.
Unfortunately, I am actually old enough to remember when video game consoles first became popular in households across America. The first one I saw was in 1981. I was in North Carolina and this kid had an Atari. He was playing Space Invaders at home. I was familiar with the game Space Invaders, but only from the arcade room. I thought it was cool that he could play Space Invaders right at home. In 1982, I received an Atari 2600 with the popular video game Pac-Man. I also had a boxing video game that had come out in 1980 that was just titled Boxing. The Atari's games were low quality and repetitive. Of course, we did not know this at the time because these were the only games available, okay? The more challenging, higher quality games still remained in the arcade room. Every time I would go to an arcade room, I would seek out action-packed games. I would always look for games that involved some kind of combat. Now you guys know me, all right? I did some research. The Ringside Historians will be joining me for a future discussion on an extended version of this subject. Like I said, I did some research and apparently the first boxing video game came out in the year 1976. The game released by Sega was called Heavyweight Champ. This was the first game of its kind. You could find this game in arcade rooms as early as 1976. Most of the games that occurred in arcade rooms in the early years, before Pac-Man and Space Invaders, were pinball machines for the most part. I remember those years very well. I can remember all the way back into the 1970s. So Heavyweight Champ was the first action game that appeared in the arcade rooms in 1976. From what I read, there are not many of these video arcade machines still remaining, okay? It's very rare to find an original arcade machine, and I'm talking about the arcade machine Heavyweight Champ, the original 1976 version. I was around in 1976, but wasn't playing arcade games yet. By the time I got to the arcade room around 1979 or 1980, I don't recall seeing this game Heavyweight Champ, but maybe the historians Curtis Anderson or Stormy B-Man will remember this game. The next boxing video game to appear surfaced on the video game and console Atari Video Computer System, also known as Atari 2600. Some people called it Atari VCS. In 1981 or 82, they changed the name to Atari 2600. There was a game on Atari 2600 or Atari VCS, and it was called Boxing. I did not own this game myself until 1982, but the original release date was 1980. I had fun playing this game, and it was something different to do as the video game consoles were still new to American households. In 1981, Intellivision released their version of Boxing. I'm pretty sure Curtis Anderson and Stormy B. Man, I'm sure you guys remember Intellivision. I didn't get an Intellivision until 1983. I was lucky to get the boxing game right away, which originally surfaced in 1981. It was an improvement from what Atari had to offer the previous year. Atari had a game in 1980 called Boxing, Intellivision had a game in 1981 called Boxing. I didn't get hold of these games until 82, 83. Doing my research, I could not find any boxing video games that surfaced in the year of 1982. Throughout 1981 and 1982, the only two games that were around at that time were Atari and Intellivision's versions of boxing. Boxing fans grew tired of these two basic games. We found ourselves at the arcade room playing games like Donkey Kong, Frogger, Defender, Pole Position, and at home the games were getting a little better too. We now had games like Pitfall and River Raid, okay? This is 1983, 84 time period. Boxing needed a better game at this point. Well, that game came out in 1983. It surfaced at the arcade room. The game was called Punch-Out! Punch-Out! Had much better graphics than the two boxing games one could play on the video game consoles. There was now characters with personalities. There was also a champion. The video gaming industry had never seen anything like Punch-Out! I remember this game taking several of my quarters. People would gather around to watch others play to see who could get the farthest in Punch-Out! I lost a lot of quarters to Ball Bull and Mr. Sandman. There were 6 different fighters to fight, with Mr. Sandman being the champion. After defeating Mr. Sandman, the rotation starts over with the fighters being more difficult to defeat. Punch-Out! Was a major milestone in the history of boxing video games. This was also the time aggressive behavior started at the arcade room as the line got longer to play Punch-Out! Remember when other people would place their tokens on the machine to let people know that they got downs on the machine? I saw a few people get their tokens stolen for that behavior. Punch-Out! Was the beginning to a series of games that will be released throughout the 1980s. I'm sure Kurt and Stormy B. Man could remember about that. 1983 would also be the year Commodore and Apple would get involved in boxing video games that would be released on their platforms. The first video game that would come up on Commodore and Apple would be a game called Sierra Championship Boxing. It was available on the Commodore 64 and Apple II. The graphics was better than the 2 previous games that was available on home video gaming consoles, which of course was the 1980 game from Atari and the 1981 game from Intellivision, which both was titled Boxing. I did indeed have this game, Sierra Championship Boxing, but didn't get the game until about 2 years after its initial release, as I didn't get a Commodore 64 until 1985. Like I said, improved graphics when compared to Atari and Intellivision. Sierra Championship Boxing was originally supposed to be published by Microsoft, but Microsoft pulled out, deciding that the home market wasn't big enough yet for boxing video games. This game also allowed the user to choose from a large number of fighters and also allowed the user to create a fighter. There was some criticism regarding how realistic the game was, but being released on Apple and Commodore computers allowed more memory than what Atari and Intellivision had to offer. ColecoVision, another video gaming console, was not going to be left out of the boxing video games and released a boxing video game in 1983 The game would be Rocky Super Action Boxing, which was centered around the popular movie Rocky. This was a smart move by ColecoVision, as the movie series was riding high off the success of Rocky III. I did not have a ColecoVision, but a friend of mine did. I would go over to his house and play the game with him around the time it was released. This was also the first licensed game based on the movie series Rocky. Many would follow in years to come. Like all previous games with the exception of Punch-Out, there was an option to play two-player, or one could just challenge the computer. You could play as either Rocky or Clubber Lang. The game also included a pause feature, which was a big deal for that time period, to be able to hit pause. I remember thinking that the graphics looked very good. There was no doubt about it, 1983 was a big improvement in the world of boxing video games. In 1984, there was a new game introduced to arcade rooms across America. The game was called Champion Boxing. This game would also be released on the Sega SG-1000. I did not have any friends that owned the Sega SG-1000. In fact, I was not familiar with Sega until the Genesis was released in America in 1989. The SG-1000 was a pre-Genesis home video console released by Sega. It didn't matter because I ran across Champion Boxing in the arcade room. I did use quite a bit of quarters on Champion Boxing, but the majority of my quarters still went to Punch-Out and other popular games of that time period. A few months after taking notice of Champion Boxing and spending a few quarters, word on the street is that a new Punch-Out had surfaced at the arcade room. Remember, we didn't have the internet back then to research word of mouth, right? Stormy B-Man and Curtis Anderson, you guys know this, that we did not have the internet to research word of mouth. We had to go find out for ourselves. When I first heard this, I didn't believe it. Then I went to the arcade room and I saw the original Punch-Out was open for play with no line. A long line of preteens and teenagers was standing in line to play the newly released Super Punch-Out. The game was released to Japan in 1984. Nintendo released this game to arcade rooms across America in 1985. The gameplay was very similar to the original Punch-Out, and the player controlled by the participant was once again the same green-haired fighter seen in Punch-Out. There was a new lineup of fighters for the user to face now. Very popular game, man. The lines was long. I know I had a fight with some other kid one time waiting in line to play one of the games. I think it was Super Punch-Out. I'm not sure. It was either that or I think it was Super Punch-Out. In 1985, as the year rolled on, WBA World Featherweight Champion Barry McGuigan would be featured in a game made for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. That game was called Barry McGuigan World Championship Boxing. In America, it was released as Star Rank Boxing. Same game. It was called Barry McGuigan Championship Boxing in England. In America, it was called Star Rank Boxing. I had Star Rank Boxing on the Commodore 64. This game not only allowed the player to create a boxer, but now you could also choose the fighter's race, style, hair, and shorts. The player could utilize a wide variety of punches that included a cross, body punch, jab, hook, and uppercut. The player could also block. I really enjoyed the first edition of Star Rank Boxing as well as the second edition of Star Rank Boxing, which we will feature shortly. Came out a few years later. Another boxing game that would surface at the arcade rooms in 1985, the game was called Ring King. Now this game got a lot of quarters out of me. This game offers a wide variety of punch combinations and defensive maneuvers. There are also special skills that could be utilized. That includes a special uppercut in which the player can knock his opponent completely out of the ring. A couple of years later, 1987 to be exact, this game would become available on Nintendo. But in 1985, it was a popular game at the video arcade rooms. Those quarters, they were well spent. I really enjoyed playing Ring King, man. 1985 was also the year the first unlicensed version of Punch-Out would surface. The name of the game was Frank Bruno's Boxing. The game features some similar characters to what appeared in the arcade game Super Punch-Out. Of course, being offered on platforms such as Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum, the graphics was not as good. Similar gameplay, the graphics was nowhere near as good as the arcade room. Still, it was a big improvement for the home video gaming consoles. 1985 was a big year for boxing video games altogether. Another game that came out in 1985 was a game called Fight Night for the Commodore 64, Apple II, and Atari 7800. The game was released by Alcalade, who had released some top-notch sports games of that time period. In this game, there was 5 fighters to defeat. You could also customize your fighter. Not my favorite boxing game of the 1980s, but another game that indeed provided some entertainment for young kids across America in the 1980s. There are no documented video games that I can find that was released in the year of 1986. I don't know if this had to do with Sugar Ray Leonard being out of the sport and Larry Holmes going through the aging process. There just wasn't any boxing games that came out in '86. And I did some research, I couldn't find any that was released. But in 1987, a boxing video game from the 1970s made a comeback. That's right, the original boxing video game, Heavyweight Champ, was back in arcade rooms across America. Of course, with some highly improved graphics. The game had 2 controllers, 1 controller for each hand. The game received high ratings and was well received across the country. The player would use a young fighter that resembled Mike Tyson. Doing some research, I heard that Mike Tyson was the motivation behind the game. This was the first of several imitation Mike Tysons to surface in the video gaming world. The year was 1987. Heavyweight Champ, good game, decent game. I didn't spend too many quarters on Heavyweight Champ. I preferred to use my quarters for other games. As 1987 rolled on, Atari was not finished with boxing games and will release another boxing game. This game was called Real Sports Boxing. The game displayed a side view of the ring, allowing the player to move up and down, left to right. It was an improvement for an Atari game, okay? On the real, by 1987, Atari was losing momentum at a fast rate with the release of improved video game consoles. A game that featured higher quality graphics released in 1987 will come from the popular series of Rocky movies. This game was titled just Rocky. It was released on the Sega Master System. This was the second Rocky video game and had improved graphics when compared to Rocky Super Action Boxing, released from ColecoVision in 1983, which we just covered. Apollo Creed, Clubber Lang, and Ivan Drago all appeared in this game. The game could be played in 1 or 2 player mode. The player could also train Rocky in between fights. Finally, towards the end of 1987, Nintendo introduced an official addition to the Punch-Out series. Popular, undefeated, undisputed young heavyweight champion of the world, Mike Tyson's popularity was growing. It was on the rise. It was bursting out the roof for the most part. Instead of creating an imitation Mike Tyson, Nintendo would feature the young heavyweight as the face to their new boxing game. There had been an unlicensed Punch-Out game released a few years earlier called Frank Bruno Boxing. In that version, the player actually fought as Frank Bruno. In this game, the user would have to fight Mike Tyson. And let me tell you something, man, Tyson was not easy to defeat. The player's only option was a little fighter of short stature called Little Mac. Another interesting point I found out about the development of this game is that Mike Tyson was rumored to only receive $50,000 for this game. He had signed a 3-year contract, from what I read, with Nintendo in 1986 before the Berbick fight. You see, at the time Nintendo was negotiating with Team Tyson, Nintendo was taking a risk because Tyson was a few months out from defeating Trevor Berbick, okay? When it was all said and done, Mike Tyson came out on the short end because the game was a hit. By the time it was released to the public, Tyson was the heavyweight champion of the world. Also appearing in this game was past opponents from the Punch-Out series and a few new opponents, okay? Boxing video games continued to drop at a fast pace in 1988. In fact, 2 boxing games would be released for the arcade room, and Commodore would release a decent boxing game that year. In 1988, a new game, The Final Round, would appear in arcade rooms across America. The gameplay fits into the time period of the late 1980s. In the beginning of the game, the player is given a number of points that are distributed towards the fighter's skill set by the user. The 3 skills of focus are all important. They include speed, power, and stamina. After every 2 bouts, the player can enter a training session to improve the fighter's skill set. This game also continued the imaginary imitation Mike Tyson fighters. The year was 1988. Mike Tyson was on top of the world and was reigning as the undisputed young heavyweight champion of the world. In the final round, the champion Black Stallion was based on Mike Tyson. The Black Stallion was a young undefeated fighter with speed and power. Another game that surfaced at the arcade rooms in 1988 was Final Blow. Now, the 2 games that appeared in the arcade room, they both had the word final in them. I'm not sure which game was released first between the Final Round and Final Blow. Both came out in '88. I do know that Final Blow appeared in arcade rooms in April of 1988. Final Blow would also be re-released in 1990 on the Sega Genesis console as James Buster Douglas Boxing. But in 1988, Mike Tyson was on top of the world, and only hardcore fans knew who James Buster Douglas was. Many of us knew Buster Douglas as an underachieving heavyweight that fell short in a title fight against Tony Tucker. Like I said, the arcade version surfaced in 1988. Many of my quarters at that time was going towards other action games such as Double Dragon, Renegade, Street Fighter, but I played both the Final Round and Final Blow. Imitation Mike Tyson's would appear in some of the other action games as well. One game that featured an imitation Mike Tyson as the heavyweight champion was Commodore 64's Star Rank Boxing 2. Star Rank Boxing 2 also appeared on Apple II. I actually really enjoyed Star Rank Boxing 2, but they made their imitation Mike Tyson way too hard to defeat. Of course, they changed his name a little bit. His name on Star Rank Boxing was Iron Ike Meissen. In this game, you could create a fighter and save the fighter on the hard drive. I thought the fighter creation mode was top-notch for that time period. It was the best fighter creation mode that I saw up to that point. This was also the second part to 1985's Barry McGuigan's Boxing, or you could call it Star Rank Boxing 1. In England, they called it Barry McGuigan Boxing. In America, they called it Star Rank Boxing 1. In my opinion, the second edition of Star Rank Boxing was better. In fact, it was the best boxing game ever released on Commodore 64, and I played pretty much all of them. Now, in 1989, there was only one boxing video game to surface. That game was called Digital Champ Battle Boxing. It was featured on the TurboGrafx 16 platform. I had a TurboGrafx 16, but Digital Champ was not my favorite boxing game. I would like to say Happy New Year to everybody. I do intend on making more videos this year. I would also like to get the rest of the Ringside Historians in on some of these discussions, especially on retro subject matter. We'll talk about some of everything on Ringside Historians. Look out for part 2 on this. We will be discussing the years 1990 to 2019. I'm out of here.
Why? You always say you sit there in that chair and you make judgments on me. You don't know anything about me.
I am the Bishop of Battle, master of all I survey. I have 13 progressively harder levels. me if you dare. Insert coin. I am the Bishop of Battle, master of all I survey.